and gentlemen, now I'd like to call the lady on stage with utmost experience and knowledge who's going to talk about banking regulations and cloud computing risk management. Please put your hands together for Miss Rachel Yaacoby to speak few words about her. Miss Rachel managed the supervisor of bank's cybersecurity unit, which she established in 2012, and was the assistant to the supervisor of banks at the Bank of Israel. In 2015, she formulated the principal regulation for cyber defense of Israeli banks. The directive is a model for supervisory authorities worldwide. Rachel has also led other banking regulations such as cloud computing, risk management, and cyber events notifications, and much more she's going to tell us.
The question I think that the organization should ask is, are cyber risks the same as the traditional operational risks in general and information security risk specifically? Or it's more of the same, and we're just dealing with the new term, cyber, which has become very popular, very trendy. You know, that was the question actually I asked myself when I was appointed as an advisor to the supervisor of banks at the Bank of Israel several years ago. And I established the cyber function at the Banking Supervision Department to supervise the banks in terms of cyber risks. And the answer to that question is of paramount importance. Why? Going on, from the perspective of an organization, or in my case in the bank, going on protecting the organization with the same tools and the same approach of information security risks maybe is not sufficient, not adequate, and can expose the organization, to material risks. From the perspective of regulator, going on supervising the banks, in my case, with the same approach, if there has been a change, also could harm the banks, could even expose the regulatory authority to risk because we don't do our job appropriately. But looking at cyber incidents that have occurred overseas, we can tell that there has been a change. It's not new, actually. You see the number of cyber incidents has increased dramatically. Has increased dramatically. The huge volume of the huge damage that has been caused to various organizations, and the fact that many organizations, including financial institutions, state that the main risk they face is cyber. Even the financial institution that really is surprising claim that their highest risk they face is cyber risk and not financial risk like market risk, like credit risk. So even if we know the answer, that things have changed, that really cyber risks are not actually the same as the traditional classic information security risk, I would like you to analyze or to answer that question by analyzing the elements of cyber risks. So I'll give you some examples. So the cyber threats landscape is different from the known spectrum of information security risk. Why? Because the threats reside not just at the organization itself, not just at the IT function, business functions, support functions like HR and IT, of course, as well, but also the threats, exist outside the organization. They originate in external entities that have any communication with the organization, and sometimes the standards of information security of that external entity that can be service provider or counterparty, the standards do not coincide with the standards of the organization itself. So a potential attacker can take advantage, can exploit the weakness of, for example, of the specific service provider. and attack the organization. In addition, that service provider sometimes, uses several subcontractors that also are involved in providing the organization the services. So we are dealing with a very broad, landscape. As a matter of fact, it can even be endless, spectrum, endless, landscape of threats. Another point or another element of the cyber risk is the fact that at least some of the adversaries are different. The motivation of the adversaries is not just economic, to steal money. Therefore, we encounter new adversaries like activists, like terror groups, and even nations. Their motivation and ambition could be also social or political. Some of them are well-funded. You know that they have sometimes joint venture between them, so that every one of them would like, of course, to gain its own profit. Coming to the next element of cyber risk, the characteristics of cyber risk are unique. We deal in this, I'm sure that you all know, we deal with very sophisticated attacks, very complicated. We know the term APT, Advanced Persistent Threat. In that case, the attack is tailor-made. Cyber attacks, the boundaries are not always clear. Not always the organization knows when the attack starts, when it ends. Those cyber attacks are sometimes can be used to attack physical assets like transportation, like electricity. Of course, they're anonymous, and sometimes if we talk about a kinetic weapon, they can be even cheaper than the traditional weapon. And the last key element of cyber risk is the impact. The impact of materialization of cyber risk is enormous compared to materialization of traditional information security risk. So some of the risks that derive from cyber threats are well known from the past. We've dealt with data breach, data theft, money theft, but the unique characteristic of cyber attacks may cause, the extent of stolen data or stolen money to grow dramatically. And we deal with other risks, like, disruption of the operation of the organization. In that case, if I give you an example, a bank, of course, that customers cannot utilize their accounts by digital channels because the bank, the DDoS attack has occurred. And another very, very high risk is data corruption. In that case, either the organization data is corrupted or the customer's information, but the bank, in my example, cannot count on it anymore. So what happens if, in an extreme scenario, where the number of harmed customers and the extent of stolen money and stolen data, grows dramatically? What happens, or in case of, the disruption of operations of the bank, in my case or in my example, the duration lasts for days, for weeks. And of course, if the corrupted data cannot be controlled by the organization, by the bank. So maybe the bank has to make the decision whether to shut down at least some of the services. But that cyber risk, can materialize to other risks, like reputational risk. Customers cannot count anymore on the bank. They lose distrust. So what do? They go and withdraw money, maybe close their accounts. This reputational risk grows and leads to another risk, liquidity risk, financial risk, liquidity risk. And that risk can even affect the strategic risk of the bank. The bank had in mind, had a vision to be digital, to be modern, and all his vision and all his goals collapse. And of course, there could be also a concern to the stability of the bank. So that was, you know, in terms of the impact of materialization of cyber risk. So just to give you some numbers from the last report of IBM Security and Ponemon Institute dealing with the global average of the total cost of a data breach. So it's around $4 million, but what is interesting, 36% of it is because of lost business, you know, the materialization of reputational risk. But I just want you to pay attention to the last point. In my opinion, it's very interesting because according to that report of IBM Security and Ponemon Institute, the time, of course, on average, to identify a data breach and to contain the attack and contain the damage, you know, can take around 9 months. 9 months since the incident has occurred. 279 days out of these 206 days to identify the incident and 73 days to contain it. What does it mean? We know that as long as it takes to contain a cyber attack, to contain the damage, you know, the potential damage can go up dramatically. And we know some examples from cyber incidents that occurred in the past. For example, Equifax, I'm sure that all of you heard about it. It was published in September 2017 that more than 1,405 customers were affected because of the data breach. And, you know, I said it was published, the incident. By the way, if you don't know, Equifax is a credit reporting agency. So, but, you know, it was published in September 2017, but the incident occurred several months ago, according to what was published, either 2 months or even 6 months. So therefore, the damage was so huge. So coming back to the question, I believe each organization should ask himself, and I, as I told you, as I shared with you, I asked myself when I was appointed, you know, to supervise the banks in terms of cyber risk. So if we see that the landscape is different, cyber threats landscape is different, adversaries, some of them are different, and of course characteristic of cyber attacks, and the impact is different, it means that we cannot use the approach could not be the same as the approach of information, traditional information security. There should be taken a new approach to deal with cyber risk. Cyber security is not the same as information security. Of course, we cannot neglect information security is the basis. It's basic, but still we have to take a different approach to deal with cyber risk. Actually, cybersecurity, you know, it's like, I prefer to use the term, and you can see even in the slide, to use the term cyber defense, and even in the regulation, you know, I use this term because why? Because in order to deal with the cyber risk, we have to take into account not just technology, but also the human factor, what we say people, and of course also the material business processes. So we have like a triangle of technology, people, and a process. All of them should be integrated together in order to carry out adequate cyber security or cyber defense, as I said. And cyber defense, it's like there is a transition from the traditional classic information security to cyber defense. You say we started years ago from the classic information security, now we deal with cyber defense. So, and of course cyber defense is much more broader than than information security. So we talked about cyber risk, so how to deal with them from the perspective of an organization. An organization would like to strengthen, to bolster, its ability to withstand cyber attacks and to enhance the resilience of the organization, of course. So what should he do? So in order to carry out adequate cyber defense management, the key elements of cyber defense management derive from the nature, from the characteristics of cyber risk. And I'll give you some examples. But we couldn't know it without understanding the elements of cyber risk. So for example, what are the key elements each organization should take into account when it wants, to implement, appropriate, adequate cyber defense? So first of all, the organization should know that sophisticated cyber attacks cannot always be prevented. It doesn't mean that the organization should not implement preventive protective tools, but also it is expected, to develop the capabilities of detecting, of responding, of managing cyber incident. Cyber threats, another key element of cyber defense. Cyber threats, this is not the problem or the headache of the chief cyber defense manager or the cyber expert of the organization. But first of all, it should be the concern of the board of directors and senior management. They are expected not just to raise their awareness, but they are really expected to be actively involved. They must be familiar with the cyber threats landscape of their organization. They must understand what is the impact, potential impact of materialization of cyber risk, and of course, to formulate strategy, policies, and procedures. By the way, all the business units or functions should also address the cyber risk and deal with them. No, some minutes, please. Another point, okay, I'll just maybe mention just the most important. Cyber defense management should be holistic. So you remember, I talked about the cyber threat landscape. So we derive the conclusion, what should be done? The organization is expected to map all its internal and external environment in order to understand, the threat landscape, to be familiar with the potential adversaries, what are the motivations, what could be the vector of attacks, and then to examine if the current safeguards, and measures are adequate, are sufficient to deal with those attacks. If not, of course, to implement to change them, or to implement new safeguards. The organization is also expected to be predictive, creative, to think out of the box. Why? To understand, to take, to be involved in information sharing. If we talk about a bank, to share information with the same peer groups, peer institution, in order to learn from other incidents, other cyber attacks, the characteristic of the attack, and again to examine whether the organization can withstand a similar attack. But be cautious. It's not enough to implement just technological measures. As I told you, cyber also deals with the human factor. A sophisticated spear phishing, attack can take advantage of the unawareness of an employee and get into the system, or the weak controls of the payment system, and of course steal money from the bank. So the organization should also deal with training, with drills, with exercises, not just technological measures. And it's not enough to implement all the needed safeguards and controls. The controls should be examined in order to ascertain that they are effective and they operate and react the way they are expected to. because a control cannot be adequate if technology has changed, if the business process has changed, if the organization structure has changed. So this is a very important point. So that was from the perspective of, organization, like a bank. What about the regulator? This is also means that the regulator, as I told you several years ago, when I understood that cyber defense, cyber risks are different, that we had to take a new approach to deal with cyber risk. What does it mean? That the current directive, the current regulation dealing with information security, dealing with information technology management are not sufficient. Therefore, we really we wrote from scratch a new directive, proper conduct of banking business, number 361, which actually sets out all the key elements that just of them I mentioned, all the key elements of cyber defense management and all, the key elements of cyber risk. This directive is principle-based, is flexible. Every bank can adapt it according to its risk profile. But that was not enough because regulation is one tool. By the way, afterwards we also issued a directive dealing with cloud computing. I talked about it yesterday, about supply chain and more. But this is not enough. Again, taking into account the unique element, the key elements of cyber defense that derive from cyber risk, for example, we encourage the bank, we foster them to share information, and we even help them. I set up an interbank cyber forum, professional cyber forum, which was composed of the chief cyber defense officer of all the banks and credit card companies. We used to meet every 6 to 8 weeks. Every meeting lasts at least 3 hours. We dealt with professional issues. We examined cyber incidents that occurred in Israel and overseas to find out, whether the banks can again, tackle similar attacks. I arranged for professional presentation, and also I conducted once a year, at least once a year, a sectorial cyber exercise drill. So information sharing, intelligence sharing. We also submit once a week a report including information on cyber attacks, cyber alerts, malwares, researchers, etc. Information sharing, this is new. In the era of cyber defense, this was not in the past. And I'm finishing. And the last point I would like to say that, look, even the language has changed. We talk about a change in the cyber risk. We talk about a change in cyber defense management. Even the language. We use terms that we didn't use in the past. Attack surface, information sharing, to be predictive, to be proactive. That words of terms were not used in the era of traditional information security. So just to summarize my presentation, it's challenging to deal with cyber risks. It's really challenging. Just remember that in addition to the need of the active involvement of the senior management and a board of directors, the organization is expected to think different, to change its mindset, to think different, to act in a different way in order, to include in the cyber defense management all what I just said, to be proactive, to be predictive, to be holistic. Thank you very much.